To describe the late 19th century in the United States as racist wildly underestimates in some ways how completely preoccupied large numbers of Americans were with looking at a wide variety of things around them through what you might think of as a lens of race. You can almost separate out layers or strata of racialized thinking in the late 19th century. Obviously, a great deal of racial attitudes in the United States were based on hundreds of years of experience with slavery and the political aftermath having to do with the Civil War and Reconstruction. But there were other layers as well that sort of overlapped with one another and help explain the timing of public policies with respect to segregation against African Americans in the late 19th century. In addition to white supremacy vis-a-vis African Americans, there were also hundreds of years of westward movement as against Native Americans. Furthermore, there were larger trends in Western thought, not just in the United States, but in Western Europe, that caused large numbers of white Americans and Europeans to describe a large number of the things they saw around them in the world as if they were related in a real way to biologically based racial differences. Differences in wealth or power that today we would describe as being a product of economics or culture or politics. They tended to see as if they had a racial reality. This was a period during which time the major European powers were continuing to colonize much of the world, and in the 1880s and 90s they began to do that in Africa. And their ability to succeed at that was something that they frequently interpreted as having a real relationship to racial difference in a way that today we would not accept. Another example of trends in Western thought that overlapped with existing American strains of racism have to do with the widespread influence of Charles Darwin in a lot of aspects of European and American thought. Darwin's idea about the evolution of biological species spread widely to other areas of American and European thinking about the world. And you began to hear evolutionary theories of politics and economics, in addition to evolutionary theories of biological change. And this caused large numbers of Americans and Europeans to talk about race in ways that today strike us as obviously racist, as obviously white supremacist, and defended them with what they thought at the time were the most advanced scientific or political ideas. It was not uncommon by the 1890s, for example, to hear Americans or Englishmen discuss democracy as an alleged Anglo-Saxon racial trait. And there were a variety of ways in which white Americans and Europeans didn't just think of racism as an excuse for why they disliked someone of a different color or ethnicity from them. It was something that they believed explained many of the things they saw around them that today we would explain very differently. And for many white Americans, racism was as much an expression of white supremacy, in other words, a positive self-definition, as it was a means of discriminating against others, although, as we'll see, these things overlapped in a variety of ways. A second point I would make about this is that it isn't actually the case that the system of segregation that we tend to call Jim Crow, that the civil rights movement of the post-World War II era was an effort to get rid of. It's not the case that that dates from the immediate post-Civil War period. There are actually three rough phases of public policy with respect to African Americans after the Civil War. There was an initial phase that historians usually call Reconstruction, lasting from the end of the war till sometime in the mid-1870s. And in this period of time, there was an effort. It turned out not to be a lasting effort. But there was an effort primarily by the Republican Party through the federal government and through state governments that the Republicans controlled in the former Confederacy immediately after the war. An effort to define former slaves as citizens and voters and to try to integrate them into the economy in something approaching fairness. I repeat that this did not last very long, and in some states it didn't last as long as it did in others. Most historians usually date the length of the Reconstruction period in a given state based on in what year the Democratic Party regained control of that state government. In a few states, The Republicans retained control until the mid-1870s. In others, they lost it much more quickly. But there was an initial post-Civil War period during which time some white Americans passed legislation and constitutional amendments seeking to make African Americans citizens and voters in a way that wound up becoming less true by the 1890s. Then there was a kind of an interim period that's difficult to generalize about, from the mid-1870s until the 1890s, during which time the initial efforts of Reconstruction obviously began to fade. But it was not yet the case that the formal state policies of disfranchisement and segregation in the former Confederacy had taken place. Then there was a period beginning in the 1890s during which a series of states in the former Confederacy began to systematically remove African Americans from voter rolls and jury boxes, and then pass legislation rigorously segregating virtually every aspect of public life. This is the system that we tend to think of as Jim Crow, that in the next mini lecture we will talk a little bit about the process by which Southern white supremacists created it.